Now, companies know, they know and have known for decades, far more than from the year 2000, when the Ecolog Institute report was put out, that there are effects at much lower levels than is legally allowed. As an example, T-Mobile funded a study that came out in 2000. It's called the Ecolog Institute report. They recommended, based on the studies at that time, about 2.5 decades ago, that there be an exposure limit 1,000 times lower than FCC's current power density limit. 1,000 times lower. The Los Angeles, California School District, after a lot of parents and teachers organized on the issue and shared the science, they developed what they call a cautionary level for radio frequency radiation 10,000 times lower than FCC regulations. So when we're talking about the US government limits being out of date, I'm not talking about by 10 times or 5 times or 50 times. We're talking about hundreds, thousands, in fact, tens of thousands, in fact, even more than that times, because when you start to look at the science, you realize there are studies that have found it affects very, very low levels. We need to switch to safe technology now. What's happening right now is really out of control, and it's invisible, so people don't realize it. And of course, we're all addicted to our devices. Now, I'd like to make a point, and that is that the Los Angeles School District has questionably applied this limit, just as in many of the countries that have more restrictive limits. It depends. We don't know the degree to which they are following that due to, for many reasons, of course, corporate influence, as well as simply neglect, as well as a lack of compliance. But nonetheless, in addition to this conservative level that, for example, the Los Angeles School District has on their fact sheet, in which they recommend, they also have bans on cell towers on school property. They also have a resolution saying they don't want cell towers near their schools. And just another quote from the Los Angeles, California Public School District: "It is believed that a more conservative level is necessary to protect children who represent a potentially vulnerable and sensitive population." And here we are again with these 5G towers going up right now. And if you look inside, here is an image from one of the towers done by Julie Marden, who took pictures across the city. You can see how gigantic this monstrosity is. And here you have the specs from the New York Office of Technology, where they show how inside the facility, these are all tiers for various antennas that will include not just Wi-Fi and wireless, but millimeter waves and 5G. And, you know, what an outrage. What an outrage. What's not being told when these 5G facilities are proposed is that insurance authorities have rated this technology as a high impact risk, an off the leash risk. Swiss Re has a report called 5G Off the Leash, and they consider this a high impact emerging risk due to the potential negative health effects from electromagnetic fields, which they state are likely to increase over time. They also talk about hacking and exploiting 5G to steal data and privacy, security, and espionage issues, all of which are so important in 5G privacy. And just a quote: "As the biological effects of EMF in general and 5G in particular are still being debated, potential claims for health impairments may come with a long latency." That means we might not see it now, but we're going to see it later. And that is why, in fact, insurance companies don't insure cell phone companies or cell tower companies for damages, and they haven't for decades. They're not taking the risk. There was a report from 2010 by Lloyd's of London, which compared it to asbestos, and actually several reports comparing the legal liability risks to asbestos. Lloyd's of London said, "The danger with EMFs is that, like asbestos, The exposure insurers face is underestimated and could grow exponentially and be with us for many years. It is, in fact, the industry standard to exclude EMFs in general policies. In fact, it is defined as a pollution. Non-ionizing electromagnetic fields, even though they're non-ionizing, is defined as a pollution in insurance policies. And as well, the companies themselves, they define it as a pollution. Here is just a little screen save from a Verizon like total mobile protection insurance that you can buy for your phone. And it says that this insurance doesn't apply to certain exclusions. One of them is pollution. And the definition of pollution includes artificially produced electric fields, magnetic fields, electromagnetic fields, sound waves, microwaves, and all artificially produced ionizing or non-ionizing radiation and or waste. I mean, there it is, right? So in fact, there are many lawsuits, and that's a whole bucket of information that if you are connected with groups, you will stay up to date on. But because of the lawsuits around this issue that have been going back decades, companies, cell phone companies, they warn shareholders of risk, but not consumers or neighbors or people living near their equipment. They say in their 10K filings, and all the cell tower companies have filings that they do to the federal government related to and to their shareholders, where they say, for example, as Crown Castle says, if radio frequency emissions from wireless handsets or equipment on our communications infrastructure are demonstrated to cause negative health effects, potential future claims could adversely affect our operations, costs, or revenues. We currently do not maintain any significant insurance with respect to these matters. They tell you they don't have insurance. And they need to do that because later in time, when the lawsuits become, when there's winning lawsuits, which we believe there will be, at that time, shareholders are going to say, wait, why didn't you warn us? And that's, they have to let the shareholders know. But they don't let us know. Here, let me show you what this image is. This is a T-Mobile installation at a Detroit school where the parents worked so hard to try to stop these antennas from transmitting, but were unable to, despite quite the valiant effort, I must say. And you can just look up Wyandotte in Michigan, and you can learn more about the story of that specific school installation. And by the way, in Detroit, Michigan, they are up all over, and dozens of schools, actually. This is right in the playground, beaming down into the playground. In fact, T-Mobile says in its report, the FCC has from time to time gathered data regarding wireless device emissions, and its assessment of the risks associated with using wireless devices may evolve based on its findings. So here, T-Mobile is actually talking about how what the FCC says about risks may change. They're not saying safety is assured. We know it's safe. It's proven safe. No, they don't say that. They caution that there may be a change. Any of these allegations or changes in risk assessments could result in customers purchasing fewer devices and wireless services, could result in significant legal and regulatory liability, and could have a material adverse effects on our business, reputation, financial condition, cash flows, and operating results. So again, they warn their shareholders, but not the consumers, not us, not the people. And here is the cell tower near the high school, which I went to many years ago. And here it is, this antenna, and as you can see, right on top are two birds. I think three, actually. But here it is, so close to the school. And by the way, the playing field is on the other side, and that is where you get the high level of exposure to, is right there about 200 to 300 feet out, depending on the antennas. And I don't know if you can tell, but there's actually some trees downed here, because what happened was there were all these trees that were along that fence, and there's all these trees that were actually around the backside too. The majority of them are dead and gone since this tower has been up, which I'm going to talk more about. There are school boards and school communities across the nation opposing and or banning new cell towers on school property. Los Angeles Board of Education, the Palo Alto, California Unified School District resolution. They support the city, which has a 1,500-foot setback, and they for towers near schools, and they oppose cell towers on or in close proximity to schools to ensure individuals, especially children, are protected from the potential negative health effects associated with radiation exposure. The West Linn Wilsonville, Oregon School Board, the Greenbelt, Maryland City Council, in my community where I used to live, they issued an opposition to cell towers at schools when every single school in the entire district was part of this whole leasing plan that had happened unbeknownst to the majority of the community. Whole story there. Then there is the Temecula Valley in California Unified School District. They just passed a ban on new cell towers or renewing existing cell tower leases for towers on school property. If you're interested in this, please contact Environmental Health Trust. We have a toolkit and we're really working on this cell tower near school issue. Now, more recently, if you're wondering about the science, one study I would just point out, because I could give you 100 or I could give you one that's like a good starting study, which is a review by Alfonso Balmori, published just in 2022, called Evidence for Health Risk by RF on Humans Living Around Mobile Phone Base Stations from Radiofrequency Sickness to Cancer. And that study looked at a lot of the studies on people living near cell towers. And they, I'm going too fast. And they found documentation of three major buckets of issues. One was cancer, biochemical changes in the blood and other changes that you can test for, as well as radiofrequency sickness, headaches, neurological issues, brain fog, that constellation of impacts that people have found when they are overexposed to cell tower, Wi-Fi, wireless radiation. A really important study published in Environmental Research. Now, also, there is a study published a few years earlier by Pierce called Limiting Liability with Positioning to Minimize the Negative Health Effects of Cellular Phone Towers. This is a publication for companies, for municipalities, saying if you want to minimize your risk and liability, it's best to have a 500-foot setback. Restrict antennas, base station antennas, those are cell tower, rooftop mounted base station antennas, near homes, schools, and hospitals, to 500 meters, okay, to protect companies from future liability. And that is because, one, there's this growing science. Two, there's no oversight on cell tower and 5G antennas. There's no entity that is looking at the science, all of the science, all the up-to-date science to ensure safety. In fact, when I raise this issue and when people across the country raise the issue of wireless radiation, they're told, oh, the FDA says it's safe, except the FDA has no authority over cell tower radiation. They even said in multiple emails, which are all documented on the Trust site, that, for example, the director of the FDA Office of Policy and Center for Devices and Radiological Health said in a 2020 email, the FDA does not regulate cell towers or cell tower radiation. Therefore, the FDA has no studies or information on cell towers to provide in response to your questions. That was in response to a mother that had written about a cell tower near her home. And yet, here we are. This is Bennett Elementary in Detroit, where over a dozen schools have these antennas mounted, beaming right into the playgrounds And it is outrageous, just outrageous that our country doesn't have a restriction on cell towers near or on school property. Many countries have actually banned cell towers on schools. The Santa Clara County Medical Association, another great resource for toxins in the air and water, and also electromagnetic fields. They have a best practices for school document where they recommend that there be the restriction of towers at least 1,640 feet from schools. And so does the New Hampshire 5G Commission final report. So do many, many studies that have been published that looked at all of the science. In fact, human rights experts, and we have this on our website on the cell towers page, they have published a study saying this is a human rights issue because children have no say right now. We're talking about their future. And what could be, we need to protect their future and not just play Russian roulette. Really, it's not even playing a game. We know that this radiation has, that there's documented biological effects. So it's not benign. Now, in the school setting, there are high exposures to multiple sources, not just the cell towers outside, but the cell phones. Every kid has a cell phone, maybe two. The laptops, tablets, the Wi-Fi routers, the cell boosters, the projectors, the smartwatches, fitness trackers, keyboards, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, all over, right? This is the school setting. And in fact, several studies have found elevated levels in classrooms because of this, more so than in your home, more so than in other areas, because you have this density of devices. And also with all of these kids on all of their phones, which are transmitting, they're not turned off. This is a really important issue that we are also highly focused on at Environmental Health Trust. The Santa Clara, California Medical Association has recommendations for best practices for technology in schools. Create a Safe Tech in Schools program to educate students and teachers and the school community on reducing wireless radiation. Create cell phone-free policies for the classroom. That's just a great starting, easy do. Just cell phone-free policy. It helps with teaching as well as the radiation. Have them turned off and stowed away. Some schools have them go in these pouches, and those pouches, but really we need to make sure that they're turned off. That's very important, or they're still transmitting. Prefer hardwired Ethernet devices instead of Wi-Fi. Have professional measurements done for the RF levels, and avoid installation of smart meters. These are just a few of the recommendations of the Santa Clara Medical Association. There's also the New Jersey Education Association did a report on this. The Maryland State Advisory Council on Children and Environmental Health Protection, I worked on that, has recommendations for schools, and many entire governments have recommendations for schools, which is all on our website again. So please think about this. If you have kids, get involved, contact us. There's also Tech Safe Schools. Now on to another issue, birds, bees, trees, and wireless. We have all of these branded wireless products, right? You've got Amazon Echo Alexa speakers, which are animal. They have animal prints. We have Save the Bees phone cases, a phone case that is a bee, and yet this radiation, which is emerging out, is going right into animals' living space. And they are being exposed to such high levels because they perch right on top of antennas, right? They are right there in the high beam. Birds are flying, trees are right in that space, limbs are right in that space, and of course, insects are right in that space. And these limits that we have were never meant to apply to animals. They are only for humans. No country has developed science-based environmental exposure limits to protect wildlife, to protect plants, to protect trees, street trees. They just haven't been developed that way. We have a severe regulatory gap. And it's not like we haven't known for a long time. This study was in the FCC proceeding. The FCC was given this study. It was a review from 2013 that found significant effects on birds, insects, other vertebrates, other organisms, and plants in 70% of the studies, with the development and reproduction of birds and insects the most strongly affected endpoints. Yet the FCC ignored this study. And look, here are these birds perched right on the antennas. Now, later in 2021, and actually several other studies that I want to talk about, but in 2021, there was a landmark review published by US experts. You can look up, there's Dr. Henry Lai, Blake Levitt, as well as Albert Manville, who formerly worked at the US Fish and Wildlife Service. They did this incredible comprehensive review of over 1,200 studies on impacts to flora and fauna. They found biological effects across all taxa, all species that had been looked at, and all frequency studies, and at vanishingly low intensities comparable to today's ambient exposures. And they say broad wildlife effects have been seen on orientation, migration, food finding, reproduction, mating, nest and den building, territorial maintenance and defense, and longevity and survivorship. Cyto and genotoxic effects have been observed. Very important three-part review that was again submitted to the FCC. And yet, the FCC has so far ignored it and not responded to the order to address environmental impacts. Just last year, a published systematic review on insects was published, and reviews on environmental health. And they found, as we've known, that the vast majority of studies found effects, generally harmful ones, in a nutshell. And the majority of studies on wireless radiation found effects, including to reproduction, development, metabolism, behavior, orientation, memory, oxidative stress, and DNA damage. And then, of course, we have this situation where 5G is going to use these higher frequencies, never used commercially in the way they're being used. And those so-called small cells, which are not small, which are emitting the sub-millimeter and millimeter frequencies, what about the impacts to insects and to bees and pollinators? What you're seeing here is a study that looked just at exposure, and they took a bee, they modeled it, they simulated the exposure into the bee body from frequencies at the same power level, but at different frequencies, showing frequencies currently in use to the 5G frequencies and beyond. So here you can see 2 gigahertz, 6 gigahertz, 12 gigahertz, and 24 gigahertz. And what they found is that as the frequencies got higher, closer to the size of the insect, that the absorption increased, because there is a level at which there's a resonance for not just bodies, but actually various skin tissue structures. And resonance means that the exposure goes all the way through and is entirely different than when you're not at that level. You think about an opera singer singing and a glass breaks. How does that happen? There's this pitch, there's this moment where the note hits exactly where it resonates with the glass breaks. But yet the same amount of sound at a different note does not have the same effect. And that's a way to think about this issue. So this was a very important study. Thielens et al. There's actually three now, studies that these scientists have been a part of where they've looked at exposure. There's another one where they looked at into brain tissue as well as into the stomach, the other critical organs of the bees, and that's all on our website, wildlifeandwireless.org, by the way. But how these scientists end with this study, which was submitted to the FCC, This could lead to changes in insect behavior, physiology, and morphology over time. And again, 5G is using frequencies low and mid band, but also these high bands. And in fact, more and more technology is coming out using these higher bands with no consideration of the impacts to our insects. There's studies showing injury to trees. There's a 216 study that followed dozens of trees in two German cities over 9 years. They measured the radiation on the different sides of the trees. They looked at where the nearest or the base station antennas were and found that the majority of trees that were in the main beam showed significant damage from the cell phone mast radiation. They state statistical analysis demonstrated that electromagnetic radiation from mobile phone masts is harmful for trees. And there are a lot of images in these reports, and the authors have published several reports that go along that have pictures showing like the antennas and then the damage to that tree canopy right in the line of the main beam. And here's another image of the same tree over time. They tracked trees over many years, 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016. You can see the thinning to the tree, and ultimately it was felled. And yet this is a fake tree, all of these fake trees that are being built with antennas. They are not even trees. What insanity we have going on right now. Now, I wanted to make a note about India. India looked at the science on impacts to trees, birds, bees. They had a interministerial report that was put forward in 2012, looking at all of the science. And they found that the vast majority of published literature indicated deleterious effects in various species. And they actually dropped their limits to 10% of ICNIRP. Now, this wasn't based on, it's very important, this wasn't based on what they knew was a safe level, but rather that they should lower it, being that they found all of these studies, and they chose 10% of ICNIRP. So they have more stringent limits. They also made a series of really incredible recommendations in their 2012 report. They recommend that EMFs be recognized as a pollutant with regular auditing of the levels near schools, hospitals, and ecologically sensitive areas, and that there be more protections for flora and fauna in urban areas. Unlike the United States, India, as well as many other governments, actually measures and does compliance and oversight with companies on their cell towers. They found hundreds of installations were out of compliance in India just last year. And every year, they actually post their reports. They audit a certain percentage of installations in the country. And this is a massive program. And yet in the US, we have no such thing. We have never looked at all of the science. We don't measure the environmental levels. We aren't checking that companies are doing what they say they should do. So there are a lot of changes that need to happen here. And we need limits that are based on an ecosystem approach, not just for humans, but also for wildlife, and that consider the interdependent, interconnected relationships of microbiota, plants, and animals. So we need that ecosystem approach. And that's all in the Levitt et al. Publicate three-part review. The third part of that review is all about the regulatory needs. The limits need to address biological impacts. They also need to address unique exposure characteristics like modulation and pulsation and long-term chronic exposures, and how this radiation is synergistic with other environmental pollutants. Please also go, in addition to ehtrust.org, to wildlife and wireless.org. We have the science, we have how to take action, we have posters, we have all kinds of resources put together on impacts to the environment. And here's some examples of our resources. There's also wirelessenviroimpacts.science, which we put together because we wanted the UN Convention on Biological Diversity to address this issue too. And we did that in collaboration with Prevent Cancer Now, Canadians for Safe Technology, and several other groups. Now, how did this all happen? Well, before 1996, the EPA was in development of radiofrequency exposure guidelines. What you're seeing here is actually a slide. It's the slides at the top of the presentation slides on the development of radiofrequency guidelines that the EPA was in process of doing back in 1996. They said at that time, in 1995, actually, I'm sorry, completion of the guidelines in a timely manner remains a priority of this office. Well, guess what? They were completely defunded from this issue. And that's how we ended up where we are. They were looking at limits that would address heating as well as biological effects. But then in 1996, the FCC adopted limits based on industry groups' recommendations that only address heating effects. There's actually research that the US government and many countries have done going back decades. This is a 1965 Ford Motor Company report. And you can look at the contents. You see they looked at impacts to EEG, on sleep, on nervous system, and so forth. And even going back further, there are studies, this is actually from the World Health Organization in 1973 proceedings, but looking at biological effects. But going back further, post-Cold War, and in the Russia and the US government were in a race to study this issue because they were looking at radar and so forth. So there is a long history of science the US government has known for decades. This is the WHO 1973 report that was looking at not just cancer, but all kinds of other issues. There's even a NIOSH, the National Institutes of Occupational, they were looking at this issue of microwave and biological effects. But right now, the NIOSH, the Department of Labor, they have not looked at the issue of occupational exposure at all. It's a real regulatory gap. In fact, we don't even have federal safety standards because when the EPA was defunded and the FCC adopted these limits, that's not called the proper safety standard. Those are guidelines that the FCC adopted, and those are limits that we have, but they're not safety standards proper.